Kim Tae made a decision that shocked everyone in the exam room, including Captain Hana. He ordered 5 of his remaining ships to surrender to the enemy. The alien students could not believe what they were seeing. The humans were giving up their precious ships to an enemy that already outnumbered them. 10-1, a Nexari student whose crystal body flashed angry red colors said, "This is madness. The humans are throwing away their only advantages. Why would any commander voluntarily give ships to the enemy?" But Kim Tae had a plan that was more complex than anyone realized. The 5 ships that surrendered were not random choices. Each ship carried carefully selected crew members and specific types of equipment. When the enemy captured these ships, they also captured the human crews and began interrogating them according to their own military procedures. The captured human crews had been trained by Choi Nara in what she called information warfare. Each prisoner told the enemy interrogators a slightly different story about human tactics and strategies. The stories were not completely false, but they were designed to make the enemy think they understood human planning when they actually did not. The enemy intelligence officers collected all these stories and tried to piece together a complete picture of human military doctrine. Choi Nara had spent weeks studying captured enemy communications and had learned something very important about enemy psychology. The enemy species had evolved on a world where survival depended on following strict social rules. They believed that every intelligent species must have similar social structures and military organizations. When the enemy analyzed the false information from captured humans, they tried to fit it into their own understanding of how armies should work. Park Ryu had been busy with an even stranger mission. He had landed small teams of humans on several worlds that were already under enemy control. These humans were not soldiers trying to fight the enemy. Instead, they were teachers whose job was to educate enemy civilian populations about basic engineering and electronics. Park Ryu's teams taught enemy civilians how to repair simple machines, how to build basic communication devices, and how to organize work groups. The enemy military commanders saw these human teachers as harmless. The enemy had conquered many worlds before and always found that civilian populations eventually accepted their rule. The enemy did not worry about a few humans teaching basic skills to conquered civilians. What the enemy did not understand was that Park Ryu was not teaching civilians how to fix machines. He was teaching them how to break machines in ways that looked like accidents. Within days of the human teaching sessions, enemy military bases on occupied worlds began experiencing equipment failures. Power generators developed mysterious problems that caused blackouts. Communication systems started producing static, and interference transportation vehicles broke down more frequently and took longer to repair. The enemy blamed these problems on poor maintenance or defective equipment. They never suspected that their own civilian workers had been taught how to sabotage the systems they were supposed to maintain. Captain Hana watched the simulation with growing amazement. The enemy forces under her control were still much stronger than the human forces, but they were becoming less effective every hour. Enemy fleets were spending more time dealing with supply problems, communication failures, and equipment breakdowns than they were spending on actual military operations. The most brilliant part of the human strategy was how they used enemy success against them. Every time the enemy won a battle and occupied a new world, they inherited the civilians that Park Ryu's teams had already taught. The more territory the enemy conquered, the more sabotage problems they faced. The enemy's own victories were slowly destroying their ability to fight effectively. Choi Nara revealed another layer of the human plan. She had been studying enemy cultural and historical records through captured databases and had discovered something that the enemy themselves had forgotten. Their species was not actually one unified race, but was made up of 3 different subspecies that had merged together thousands of years ago. Each subspecies had slightly different physical characteristics and social customs, but They had been living together peacefully for so long that most individuals did not think about these differences anymore. Using the communication codes that Park Ryu had captured, Choi Nara began broadcasting propaganda messages on enemy communication channels. These messages were designed to look like they came from enemy political leaders. The messages reminded the three subspecies about their historical differences and suggested that one subspecies was being treated better than the others. In the current military campaign, the enemy command structure tried to stop these propaganda broadcasts, but could not find their source. The messages appeared to come from legitimate enemy communication stations and used proper enemy military codes. Enemy officers who tried to investigate the source of the messages found themselves questioning whether their own colleagues might be involved in spreading divisive propaganda. Kim Tae coordinated all these different operations like a conductor, leading an orchestra. Every fake order that Park Ryu sent, every piece of false information that captured prisoners provided, and every propaganda broadcast that Choi Nara created was designed to work together. The enemy forces were being attacked, not just by human ships, but by their own confusion, fear, and suspicion. The alien students watching the simulation were beginning to understand that the humans were fighting a completely different kind of war. The Vorthak students fought to prove their strength and courage. The Nexari students fought to achieve perfect tactical efficiency. The Olmec students fought to protect what they valued most. But the humans were fighting to make their enemies defeat themselves. Captain Hana found herself having to make the enemy forces more paranoid and suspicious to counter the human psychological warfare. She made enemy commanders start questioning orders from their own superiors. She made enemy intelligence officers doubt the information they received from their own sources. She even made enemy soldiers suspicious of their own equipment and supplies, but every defensive measure that Captain Hana implemented only gave the humans new opportunities to exploit. The more paranoid the enemy became, the easier it was for the humans to spread false rumors and create panic. The more the enemy questioned their own information, the more they relied on outside sources which the humans could manipulate. By the end of the third hour, the simulation had evolved into something that no military academy had ever seen before. The enemy still had superior firepower and numerical advantages, but their forces were scattered, confused, and fighting each other as much as they were fighting humans. Enemy fleets were arriving late to battles because they had received false movement orders. Enemy supply convoys were going to the wrong locations because their navigation systems had been sabotaged. Enemy commanders were making poor decisions because they could not trust the information they were receiving. The humans had not won the war through superior military force. Instead, they had won by turning the enemy's own strengths into weaknesses. The enemy's rigid hierarchy became a vulnerability when false orders were introduced. The enemy's trust in their own systems became a weakness when those systems were sabotaged. The enemy's unified culture became a source of division when old prejudices were deliberately awakened. Kim Tae looked at the strategic display and saw that the enemy forces were beginning to collapse from within. It was time to implement the final phase of their plan, which would complete the transformation of the enemy invasion into an enemy civil war. The first reports came in like a storm of bad news. Enemy ships were appearing everywhere at once. 17 different star systems were under attack, and each enemy fleet was massive. The computer screen showed red dots moving toward blue dots. Like wolves chasing sheep, Kim Tae looked at the numbers and saw that the enemy had more than 200 ships, while the Human Defense Force had only 20 ships. All around the exam room, alien students were doing what they had been taught. The Vorthak students immediately started moving their ships into battle formations. They wanted to meet the enemy in direct combat and fight ship to ship. The Nexari students began calculating which worlds they could save and which worlds they would have to abandon. They made perfect mathematical decisions about where to send their limited forces. The Olmec students started building defensive positions around the most important worlds and prepared to wait for the enemy to come to them. But Kim Tae did something that made every alien student stop and stare. He split his 20 ships into 20 separate groups. Each group had only one ship, and he sent each ship in a different direction. Instead of grouping his forces together for strength, he scattered them across the entire galaxy like seeds in the wind. A tall Vorthak student with 6 arms pointed at Kim Tae's screen and said loudly, "The human has gone crazy. He is sending single ships against entire enemy fleets. They will all be destroyed in minutes." Captain Hana watched Kim Tae's strategy with great interest. She controlled the enemy forces and could see exactly what the human ships were doing. The single human ships were not attacking the main enemy fleets. Instead, they were moving toward small targets that most students ignored. The human ships attacked supply convoys that carried fuel and food to the enemy fleets. They destroyed communication stations that helped enemy ships talk to each other. They attacked repair stations where damaged enemy ships went to get fixed. Park Ryu was in charge of something he called special operations. While Kim Tae commanded the main strategy, Park Ryu took 3 of the 20 human ships and did something even stranger. He flew his ships directly into enemy-controlled space and then turned off their engines. The ships floated in space like dead rocks while enemy patrols flew past them. The alien students thought Park Ryu had made a terrible mistake, and his ships would be captured or destroyed, but Park Ryu was not making a mistake. He was being very clever. His ships were equipped with listening devices that could intercept enemy radio messages. The 3 human ships floated silently in enemy territory and recorded every message the enemy forces sent to each other. Park Ryu learned how the enemy commanders talked to their soldiers. He learned their code words and their standard procedures. He even learned the names of enemy officers and which ones were more important than others. Choi Nara had the strangest job of all. She was not commanding ships or fighting battles. Instead, she was studying the enemy like a scientist studies insects. She analyzed every enemy message that Park Ryu intercepted. She looked at how enemy ships moved in formation. She studied how long it took enemy fleets to make decisions and change their plans. Choi Nara was trying to understand how the enemy thought and what they believed was important. The alien students, watching the simulation, were getting more and more confused. The human strategy did not look like any military plan they had ever seen. The humans were not trying to win battles or protect territory. Instead, they seemed to be playing some kind of strange game that no one else understood. Captain Hana made the enemy forces respond to the human attacks. When enemy supply convoys were destroyed, she made the enemy send stronger escorts to protect future convoys. When communication stations were attacked, she made the enemy build backup communication systems. But every time she tried to counter the human strategy, the humans adapted and found new targets to attack. After 1 hour of simulation time, the results were shocking. The alien students had been fighting proper military battles and following standard tactics. The Vorthak students had won 3 battles and lost 2 battles. The Nexari students had successfully evacuated civilian populations from 4 threatened worlds. The Olmec students had built strong defenses around 6 important planets, but the human students had done something completely different. They had not won any major battles, but they had attacked more than 50 different small targets throughout enemy territory. The enemy forces were still very strong, but they were starting to have problems. Enemy ships were running low on fuel because their supply convoys kept getting attacked. Enemy commanders were having trouble communicating with their fleets because their communication networks were being disrupted. Enemy fleets were taking longer to repair battle damage because their repair stations were being destroyed. Park Ryu's special operations ships had captured several small enemy vessels by pretending to be disabled. His teams boarded the enemy ships and downloaded their computer files. Then they let the enemy crews escape in lifeboats while they kept the enemy ships. Park Ryu now had access to enemy communication codes and could listen to enemy radio traffic without being detected. The most shocking thing happened when Park Ryu started sending fake messages on enemy communication channels. He had learned enough about enemy procedures to send messages that sounded real. Enemy ships received orders that seemed to come from their own commanders. These fake orders told enemy fleets to change course, move to different positions, or wait for further instructions. The rigid enemy command structure meant that soldiers always obeyed orders, without question. So when Park Ryu sent fake orders, the enemy ships followed them. Captain Hana realized that the humans were not fighting a normal war. They were fighting what military experts called asymmetric warfare. The humans were too weak to win direct battles, so they were attacking the enemy's ability to fight wars. The enemy still had more ships and more weapons, but they were having trouble using their advantages effectively. Choi Nara made an important discovery while studying enemy communication patterns. She noticed that the enemy had a very strict hierarchy. Every enemy officer had a specific rank, and they never questioned orders from higher-ranking officers. This system worked well when everything was going according to plan, but it became a weakness when plans started going wrong. Enemy officers who received contradictory orders did not know how to decide which orders were real. Kim Tae saw the opportunity that Choi Nara had discovered. He ordered his scattered ships to start attacking enemy command posts. Instead of destroying the command posts completely, the human ships damaged them just enough to disrupt communications. This created confusion in the enemy command structure. Different enemy fleets started receiving different orders, and some fleets stopped receiving orders at all. The live simulation was becoming more complex than anyone had expected. Captain Hana found herself having to make the enemy forces more flexible and adaptive to counter the human tactics. But every time she changed the enemy behavior, the humans found new ways to exploit the changes. The enemy forces were learning, but so were the humans, and the humans were learning faster. By the end of the second hour, the alien students were staring at their screens in disbelief. The humans had still not won any major battles, but the entire enemy invasion was starting to fall apart. Enemy fleets were scattered across the galaxy, chasing fake orders or waiting for supplies. That would never come. Enemy commanders were arguing with each other because they could not tell which orders were real and which were fake. The great enemy war machine was still powerful, but it was no longer working as one coordinated force. Kim Tae looked at his two friends and smiled. The first phase of their plan was working perfectly. Now it was time to start the second phase, which would be even more shocking than the first. The Galactic Military Academy was huge, like a floating city made of glass and metal. It moved slowly around a bright blue star, and inside its walls lived thousands of students from hundreds of different worlds. Captain Lee Hana walked through the long corridors where alien students talked in strange languages and made sounds she could not understand. She was human, and one of only 12 human teachers in the entire academy. Today was special because it was the last day of training for the final year students. Hana taught military strategy and warfare tactics to mixed groups of aliens and humans. Most of her students were not human. They came from worlds with different gravity, different air, and different ways of thinking. The Vorthak. Students were tall, with 6 strong arms and skin like rocks. They loved to fight and always wanted to solve problems with force. The Nexari looked like walking crystals that glowed with different colors when they talked to each other. They never made mistakes and always worked together perfectly. The Olmec were like clouds of gas trapped inside special suits. They moved very slowly but could think for many hours about one small problem. But Hana always felt most proud when she looked at her 3 human students. Kim Tae was 22 years old and came from a military family on Earth. His father and grandfather were both soldiers, and Kim Tae wanted to be the best officer in the galaxy. He was not the strongest student and not the smartest, but he never gave up when things got hard. Park Ryu was different from Kim Tae. He grew up on a space station near Mars and learned to fix machines before he learned to read. He was good at finding new ways to solve old problems and often made his teachers angry by not following the rules. Choi Nara was the only human female in the class. She came from a farming colony where people had to be very careful about using water and food. She was very good at understanding how different systems work together. The final exam room was the biggest space in the academy. It had walls that could show pictures of entire star systems and floors that felt like you were standing on real planets. Captain Hana stood at the front of the room and watched as 47 students found their seats. The alien students sat in groups with others of their own kind, but the three humans always sat together, even though they were very different from each other. Captain Hana touched a button and the room became dark. Then lights appeared everywhere, showing a map of the galaxy with hundreds of small dots representing different worlds. Some dots were blue for friendly worlds, some were green for neutral worlds, and some were red for enemy territory. But today there were many more red dots than anyone had ever seen before. The simulation that Captain Hana was about to start was famous throughout the galaxy. Every student who wanted to become an officer had to pass this test. It was always the same basic story. A huge alien army was attacking the core worlds of the galaxy, and the students had to defend them with limited ships and soldiers. The enemy was always much stronger, with more ships, more weapons, and more soldiers. Most students could only save about half of the worlds they were supposed to protect. Captain Hana had been running this simulation for 8 years, and she knew exactly what would happen. The Vorthax students would try to fight the enemy directly in big battles. They would win some fights and lose others, but they would save about 40% of the worlds. The Nexari students would make perfect plans and never waste any resources. They would retreat from fights they could not win and save. About 60% of the worlds, the Olmec students would build strong defenses and wait for the enemy to attack them. They would save about 30% of the worlds, but the worlds they saved would be completely safe. Human students were different. Every year, the human students tried something new. Last year, a human student named Chin tried to use the civilian population as soldiers. It did not work very well, and he only saved 25% of the worlds. The year before that, a human student tried to hide the entire fleet and attack the enemy when they were not expecting it. She saved 38% of the world's captain. Hana looked at Kim Tae, Park Ryu, and Choi Nara and wondered what they would try. She had been watching them all year and knew they were planning something. Kim Tae spent extra time in the library reading about military history from Earth. Park Ryu was always asking questions about how the simulation computer worked. Choi Nara had been studying the psychology files of different alien species. Captain Hana smiled and began to speak. "Your final exam starts now," she said. "The enemy is attacking 17 different sectors at the same time. Each enemy fleet has 10 times more ships than our defense forces. You have 3 hours to save as many worlds as possible." She paused and looked around the room. Most students were already starting to work on their computer terminals, making plans and moving ships on their personal displays. But the three humans were just sitting and listening. "There are 2 ways to run this simulation." Captain Hana continued. "The normal way uses a computer program that follows set patterns. The enemy will always react the same way to the same situations. This is how we usually run the test." Kim Tae raised his hand. "What is the other way?" Captain Hana's smile got bigger. "The other way is live mode. In live mode, I control the enemy forces myself. I can change their plans, react to your strategies, and make them do things that the computer program cannot do. It is much harder, and no student has ever saved more than 12% of the worlds in live mode." The alien students started talking to each other in worried voices. Live mode was known to be almost impossible. The enemy could adapt and learn and change their tactics based on what the students did. Most teachers only used live mode to punish students who had been causing trouble. Park Ryu looked at Kim Tae and Choi Nara, then raised his hand. "Captain, we want to try live mode." The room became completely quiet. Even the alien students who did not like humans very much looked surprised. A Vorthak student with scars on his rock-like face shook his head. "Humans are too proud," he said. "They will fail badly and learn nothing." But Captain Hana was not surprised. She had been hoping the humans would choose live mode because she wanted to see what they would do when the enemy could think and adapt. She touched her computer, and the simulation changed from automatic mode to live mode. "Now the real test begins," she said. "The enemy forces are controlled by me, and I will not be gentle. I will use every advantage and try every trick to defeat you. Good luck." Kim Tae stood up and looked at his two human friends. "Are you ready to show them what humans can do?" Ryu grinned. "Yes. But remember, we are not trying to impress anyone. We are trying to win, Choi." Nara opened her computer files and said, "Let us begin. Then we will see if our crazy plan actually works." The simulation started, and immediately red warnings appeared on every screen. Enemy fleets were attacking everywhere at once, and the human students had only minutes to make their first decisions. The real test had finally begun. Kim Tae stood up and announced to the entire exam room that he was surrendering his 3 largest remaining ships to the enemy. The alien students erupted in shocked voices. A Vorthak warrior slammed his 6 fists on his desk and shouted, "The human commander has lost his mind. He is giving the enemy our most powerful vessels." But Captain Hana held up her hand for silence. She wanted to see what the humans were planning. The 3 ships that Kim Tae surrendered were not just any ships. They were the flagship vessels that carried the most senior human officers and the most advanced communication equipment. When these ships were captured, the enemy gained access to what appeared to be the complete human command structure. The enemy interrogated the captured human officers and discovered detailed plans for human military operations. The plans showed exactly how the human forces were organized, who commanded which units, and what their future strategies would be. The enemy command was very pleased because they believed they finally understood how the humans thought and fought. What the enemy did not know was that every piece of information they captured had been carefully prepared by Choi Nara. The human officers who were captured had been trained to reveal specific false information during interrogation. The military plans they carried were sophisticated forgeries designed to make the enemy overconfident and misdirect their forces. Choi Nara had spent months studying enemy psychology through intercepted communications and cultural databases. She discovered that the enemy species had evolved as hunters on a world with very dangerous predators. Their survival had depended on being able to quickly identify threats and respond with overwhelming force. This evolutionary background made them excellent warriors, but it also gave them predictable psychological patterns. The enemy always assumed that other species would fight the same way they did when they captured. The false human military plans, they interpreted them according to their own military traditions. The plan suggested that humans were preparing for one final desperate battle, where all remaining human forces would gather together to defend their most important world. Captain Hana watched as the enemy forces under her control began reacting to this false intelligence. Enemy fleets started moving toward the location where they expected the final human battle to take place. Enemy supply lines were redirected to support this massive military concentration. Enemy reserve forces were called up and sent toward what they believed would be the decisive confrontation, but there were no human forces gathering for a final battle. The remaining human ships were scattered throughout enemy territory, continuing their sabotage and psychological warfare operations. While the enemy was concentrating their forces in one location, expecting a great battle, the humans were systematically destroying enemy infrastructure and spreading confusion throughout enemy-controlled Space Park. Ryu had been developing an even more sophisticated operation. He had studied the enemy's social structure and discovered that their society was divided into different Castes, workers, soldiers, scientists, and rulers each had specific roles and were not supposed to interfere with each other. This caste system had worked well for thousands of years because everyone knew their place and followed the rules, using captured. Enemy communication equipment Park Ryu began sending messages that appeared to come from high-ranking enemy officials. These messages suggested that the ruling caste was planning to abandon the lower castes after the war was won. The messages claimed that workers and soldiers were being deliberately sent into dangerous situations while the rulers stayed safe in protected areas. The rigid enemy caste system had always been based on trust. Each caste believed that the others would fulfill their responsibilities and work for the common good. But Park Ryu's false messages introduced doubt and suspicion into this system. Enemy workers began wondering why they should risk their lives for rulers who might abandon them. Enemy soldiers began questioning whether their orders were designed to protect them or sacrifice them. Choi Nara added another layer to the psychological attack. She had discovered that the three enemy subspecies had ancient territorial disputes that had been resolved thousands of years ago, but were not completely forgotten. Using enemy communication channels, she began broadcasting historical documents that reminded each subspecies of old grievances and territorial claims. These historical broadcasts were presented as educational materials designed to boost enemy morale by reminding them of their glorious past. But the effect was exactly the opposite. Instead of feeling proud of their history, enemy soldiers from different subspecies began remembering why. Their ancestors had fought against each other. The combination of caste suspicion and subspecies rivalry created a toxic atmosphere within enemy forces. Enemy units that had worked together perfectly began having disputes over resources territory and command authority. Enemy officers from different castes and subspecies started questioning each other's motives and competence. Captain Hana found herself controlling enemy forces that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The enemy still had overwhelming military superiority, but they were using more and more of their energy fighting internal conflicts instead of fighting humans. Enemy fleets were arriving late to battles because their commanders were arguing about strategy. Enemy supply convoys were being delayed because workers from different castes refused to cooperate with each other. The most devastating psychological weapon came when Kim Tae revealed the true purpose of the surrendered ships the enemy had captured. What they thought were the most important human commanders, but these officers were actually volunteers who had been trained in advanced psychological manipulation techniques. During their interrogations, they did more than just provide false information. They studied their enemy interrogators and learned exactly how the enemy command structure worked. The captured humans discovered which enemy officers were ambitious, which ones were insecure, and which ones were already suspicious of their colleagues. Using this knowledge, they began subtly manipulating their captors. The humans would casually mention that they had heard certain enemy officers were planning to betray their superiors or that some enemy units were secretly planning to surrender. These seemingly innocent comments were like poison dropped into the enemy command structure. Enemy officers began watching each other for signs of treachery. Enemy commanders started questioning the loyalty of their subordinates. Enemy intelligence officers began investigating their own colleagues instead of focusing on human activities. The live simulation had become something unprecedented. Captain Hana was controlling enemy forces that were technically still much stronger than the human forces, but were becoming less effective every hour. The enemy had not lost any major battles, but they were losing the war because they were defeating themselves. Park Ryu's sabotage operations had created supply shortages throughout enemy territory. Choi Nara's propaganda had revived ancient prejudices and social conflicts. Kim Tae's false intelligence had misdirected enemy forces away from actual human activities. The combination of all these psychological attacks had turned the mighty enemy invasion into a chaotic collection of suspicious, paranoid, and increasingly hostile groups. The alien students watching the simulation were learning something that would change their understanding of warfare forever. The humans had demonstrated that military victory did not always require superior weapons or larger armies. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was understanding how your enemy thought and using that knowledge to make them destroy themselves. As the fourth hour of the simulation began, enemy forces were still numerically superior and still possessed overwhelming firepower, but they were no longer fighting the humans. They had become so suspicious of each other that they were essentially fighting a civil war, while the tiny human force continued to operate freely throughout their territory. The final phase of the human plan was about to begin, and it would complete the transformation of the enemy invasion into an enemy collapse. The final hour of the simulation began with what looked like complete human defeat. Kim Tae had only 7 ships left out of his original 20. The enemy still controlled 17 star systems and had more than 150 ships that were still operational. But Captain Hana noticed something strange happening on her command displays. The enemy forces were spending more time fighting each other than they were fighting the remaining human ships. Kim Tae revealed the true scope of the human strategy. Everything they had done for the past 3 hours had been building toward this moment. Every surrendered ship, every piece of false intelligence, every propaganda broadcast, and every act of sabotage had been designed to map and penetrate the enemy command and control network. The humans had not been trying to destroy the enemy. They had been trying to take control of the enemy, Choi. Nara opened a new set of computer files that showed the complete structure of enemy communications. She had spent months before the simulation studying how different alien species organized their military hierarchies. Through captured communication codes, infiltrated personnel, and psychological manipulation, the humans had gained access to virtually every level of enemy command. Park Ryu activated a program that he called the Cascade Protocol. Using the captured enemy communication systems, he began sending coordinated false orders to every enemy unit simultaneously. Each order was carefully crafted to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities of that particular unit. Enemy fleets from the warrior caste received orders that appealed to their desire for glorious combat. Enemy supply units from the worker caste received orders that seemed designed to protect their safety. Enemy intelligence units from the scientist caste received orders that appeared to be based on logical analysis. The orders were all different, but they were all designed to create the same result. Enemy forces would be redirected away from their current missions and toward new objectives that would bring them into conflict with other enemy forces. The rigid enemy hierarchy meant that these orders would be followed without question because they appeared to come from legitimate command authority. Within minutes of the Cascade Protocol activation, the enemy invasion began to collapse. The great enemy fleet that had been gathering for the final battle suddenly received orders to split up and attack different targets. Enemy supply convoys received orders to deliver their cargo to units that were no longer in the locations specified. Enemy reserve forces received orders to defend positions that were already occupied by other enemy units. Captain Hana watched in amazement as the enemy forces under her control began attacking each other. Enemy fleets that had been working together for months suddenly became hostile when they received contradictory orders. Enemy commanders who had been coordinating their strategies began accusing each other of treachery and incompetence. Enemy supply lines collapsed as different units competed for the same resources. The psychological warfare that the humans had been conducting for hours now reached its full effect. Enemy officers who had been made suspicious of their colleagues now had apparent proof of betrayal. Enemy units from different castes and subspecies now had reasons to believe that they were being deliberately sabotaged by their own allies. Enemy commanders who had been questioning the loyalty of their subordinates now saw evidence of mutiny and rebellion. Park Ryu's special operations teams emerged from hiding throughout enemy-controlled territory. But Instead of attacking enemy installations, they began offering medical aid and humanitarian assistance to enemy civilian populations. The enemy soldiers who had been fighting each other were shocked to discover that the humans they had been sent to destroy were now helping enemy refugees and treating enemy wounded. This final psychological stroke completed the collapse of enemy morale. Enemy soldiers began asking why they were fighting a war against people who were showing more concern for enemy civilians than their own commanders were. The humans had turned themselves from terrifying invaders into compassionate helpers, while the enemy had turned themselves into chaotic destroyers. Choi Nara activated the final phase of the cascade, protocol. She began broadcasting messages on all enemy communication channels. The messages appeared to come from the highest levels of enemy command and announced that the invasion had been called off. All enemy forces were ordered to cease military operations and begin withdrawal procedures. The messages explained that the war had been a terrible mistake, caused by false intelligence and aggressive commanders who had acted without proper authorization. The messages were completely false, but they sounded exactly like the kind of face-saving announcements that the enemy leadership would make if they wanted to end an unpopular war without admitting defeat. The messages provided a way for enemy forces to stop fighting without losing honor. They could claim that they had been following orders and that the war had ended because of political decisions rather than military defeat. Enemy units throughout the galaxy began receiving these withdrawal orders, and most of them were happy to comply. The war had become confusing and frightening, with enemy forces fighting each other more than they were fighting humans. The withdrawal orders provided an escape from a situation that no longer made sense to the ordinary enemy soldiers. Kim Tae coordinated the final deception by having his remaining 7 ships broadcast surrender messages to any enemy forces that were still looking for a fight. The human ships claimed that they were out of supplies and ammunition and were requesting permission to surrender according to standard military conventions. This gave enemy commanders who still wanted to fight a way to claim victory without actually having to fight any more battles. The simulation displays showed something that had never been recorded in the history of the Galactic Military Academy. Every single core world remained under friendly control. The enemy invasion force had been completely eliminated, not through military defeat, but through total organizational collapse. The enemy had not been destroyed. They had been convinced to destroy themselves. Captain Hana looked at the final statistics with disbelief. 100% world survival rate, 0 human ships lost in direct combat. Total enemy force neutralization, achieved through psychological warfare and social manipulation. The humans had won an impossible victory by redefining what victory meant. The alien students sat in stunned silence as they tried to understand what they had witnessed. The humans had not played by any of the rules that governed civilized warfare. They had not sought honorable combat or tactical superiority. Instead, they had treated war as a problem to be solved using any methods that would produce the desired result. Kim Tae stood up and addressed the shocked classroom. "We did not win because we were better warriors," he said. "We won because we understood that our enemy's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Their unity and organization made them powerful, but it also made them vulnerable to the right kind of attack." Park Ryu added, "We studied their culture, their psychology, and their social structure until we understood them better than they understood themselves. Then we used that knowledge to turn their own systems against them." Choi Nara concluded, "Every species in this room fights wars according to their cultural traditions and values, but humans fight wars to survive, and when survival is at stake, we will use any advantage we can find, even if it means breaking every rule of civilized warfare." The cascade effect was complete. The enemy invasion had collapsed into chaos, and the human victory was total. But the real victory was not just saving the core worlds. The real victory was demonstrating that human creativity and adaptability could overcome any opponent, no matter how powerful, if the humans were willing to think differently about the nature of conflict itself. The simulation ended with a sound that no one in the Galactic Military Academy had ever heard before. Complete silence filled the exam room as the final statistics appeared on the main display screen. 100% world survival rate complete. Enemy force neutralization. 0 friendly casualties from direct combat operations. The impossible had become reality. Captain Hana stared at the numbers for a long moment before turning to face the class. She had been running military simulations for 8 years and had seen thousands of students attempt this final exam. The best previous score had been 62% world survival achieved by a perfect Nexari team that had made no tactical errors. The worst score had been 8%, achieved by a Vorthak team that had tried to fight every enemy fleet in direct combat. But the human score was not just better than previous records. It represented something that the simulation designers had believed was mathematically impossible. The enemy forces had been designed to be unbeatable through conventional military means. The only question was supposed to be how many worlds could be saved before the inevitable defeat. Kim Tae Park Ryu and Choi Nara had proven that the inevitable was not inevitable. They had changed the rules of the game by refusing to accept that the game had rules at all. A young Nexari student whose crystal body was flickering with confused patterns of light raised her hand. Captain Hana, how is this result possible? The enemy had superior numbers, superior technology, and superior firepower. No defensive strategy should have been able to achieve complete victory. Captain Hana smiled and looked at Kim Tae, who stood up to answer the question. The student is asking the wrong question, he said. The question is not how we achieved complete military victory. The question is how we avoided having to fight a military war at all. Kim Tae walked to the front of the room and pointed at the simulation display. Every species in this academy approaches warfare as an extension of their cultural values. The Vorthak fight to prove their courage and strength, the Nexari fight to demonstrate their tactical perfection, the Olmec fight to protect what they consider sacred. But humans fight for a different reason. We fight to solve problems. Park Ryu joined his friend at the front of the room. When we looked at this simulation, we did not see a military challenge. He said, we saw a problem that needed to be solved. The problem was not how to win battles. The problem was how to make the enemy stop attacking our worlds. We solved that problem by making the enemy want to stop attacking. Choi. Nara completed the explanation by activating a detailed analysis of the enemy psychological profile. We spent the first few weeks of this course studying every available record of enemy culture, society, and psychology. She said we learned that their greatest strength was their unity and their absolute trust in their command structure. But we also learned that this strength could become a weakness if we could introduce doubt and suspicion into their system. The alien students were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something much more significant than just a clever military strategy. They had seen a fundamental difference in how humans approached problems. The other species in the galaxy fought wars according to established traditions and cultural values, but humans treated war as an engineering problem that needed to be solved using whatever methods would work. A senior Vorthak student with scars covering his rock-like skin spoke up with obvious respect in his voice. Human students, your victory is impressive, but it troubles me. You used deception, manipulation, and psychological warfare. These methods are effective, but they are not honorable. Where is the glory in defeating an enemy who defeats himself? Kim Tae nodded respectfully to the Vorthak student. You are right that our methods were not honorable according to your cultural standards, he said. But we were not fighting for honor. We were fighting for survival. When your people are threatened with extinction, you use whatever methods will keep them alive. Honor is a luxury that you can only afford when you are not facing total destruction. Captain Hana decided it was time to address the larger implications of what had happened. She activated the Academy's main communication system so that her words would be recorded and transmitted to military headquarters throughout the galaxy. What you have witnessed today will change how we think about warfare and human capabilities, she announced. The human students have demonstrated that traditional military thinking has limitations that we had not previously recognized. They have shown that psychological warfare and social manipulation can be more effective than conventional weapons when used by people who understand their enemy better than the enemy understands itself. Captain Hana paused and looked directly at each of the human students. But this victory also raises important questions about the future of human integration into galactic civilization. Other species fight wars according to rules and traditions that have evolved over thousands of years. These rules exist not just for military effectiveness, but also to preserve concepts of honor, dignity, and civilized behavior. She continued, "The human approach to warfare is undeniably effective, but it is also potentially destabilizing. If humans can defeat any enemy by turning their own social structures against them, then traditional concepts of military balance and diplomatic relations may no longer apply. The galaxy will need to decide how to respond to this." New Reality Park Ryu raised his hand respectfully. "Captain, with your permission, I would like to address that concern." Directly, Captain Hana nodded and Park Ryu stood up to face the class. "Many of you are worried that humans will use these techniques against your own species," he said. "That concern is understandable, but it is based on a misunderstanding of human psychology. We developed these methods because we were facing an enemy that threatened our survival. Humans only fight this way when we have no other choice." Choi Nara added, "When humans are not threatened, we prefer cooperation and mutual benefit to conflict and domination. The psychological techniques we used in this simulation required months of preparation and study. We only invested that effort because we believed our survival depended on it. Against friends and allies, humans prefer to use our creativity and adaptability to solve mutual problems rather than to create new ones." Kim Tae concluded the human presentation. "By addressing the Academy administration directly, this simulation has taught us something important about the future of galactic civilization." He said, "Traditional military thinking assumes that different species will always fight according to their own cultural patterns, but humans have shown that those patterns can be changed. The question now is whether we will use this knowledge to create better ways of resolving conflicts without warfare, or whether we will be forced to use it in actual wars." The exam room remained silent for several minutes as everyone processed the implications of what they had witnessed. The alien students were trying to understand how their fundamental assumptions about warfare had been challenged. The Academy administration was trying to decide how to report these results to Galactic Military Command. Captain Hana finally broke the silence by announcing the final grades for the simulation. All human students receive perfect scores for tactical innovation, strategic thinking, and mission accomplishment, she said. But more importantly, all students in this class have learned something that will make them better officers in the future. You have learned that there is always more than one way to solve any problem. As the students filed out of the exam room, the alien cadets looked at their human classmates with a mixture of respect, admiration, and wariness. They had just witnessed something that would change how the galaxy thought about human capabilities. The final exam had become something much more significant than a test of military competence. It had become a demonstration that humans could rewrite the rules of civilization itself when they needed to. The 3 human students remained behind to help Captain Hana review the simulation data. They knew that their victory would be studied and analyzed by military experts throughout the galaxy. Their unconventional approach to warfare had solved an impossible problem. But it had also created new questions about the future of human integration into galactic society. The final exam was over, but its consequences were just beginning.